Okay, thanks, Laura. And good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this webinar. This is the first time Laura and I have collaborated doing this, so I'm really excited about it, and I hope we're able to answer some questions that you have about AT and IEPs. My name is Nancy Anderson, as Laura said, and I am a staff attorney with the Alabama Disabilities Advocacy Program, or ADAP for short, and we provide free legal services to persons with disabilities, including children, to protect and promote their civil rights. My co-presenter today is the lady you just heard speaking, assistive technology rock star, Laura Parks, and Laura's going to pick up right now with some of those housekeeping details she mentioned a second ago.
Thanks, Nancy. That's a big title to live up to.
Rock star.
Just so you know, we have muted everyone who's participating today, so if you are trying to ask a question via the phone or using a microphone in the computer, we cannot hear you, and no one else can. But if you would like to ask a question, feel free. There is a question box either just below your name on your toolbar, or also it is on the iPad app where you can ask a question. This question comes directly to me, and if I feel like it's a question that is applicable for the entire group, I will ask it for Nancy and I to answer, or if I feel like it's something that Nancy and I can address privately, we will also do that and send you an email. During the presentation, there'll be polls for you to participate. iPad users, I'm sorry, you're going to have to be excluded. It's not accessible. But at the end of this, we also have a brief survey, and we ask you to take that not only to help us improve the services we provide, but also to help us continue with the funding that we receive. Because I do work for STAR, which is a statewide funding program, and we have certain data we have to track and report back. All right? And we'll go ahead and get started. So the objective of today's webinar is to determine how the key factors an IEP should consider as far as when you're looking at a student's needs for assistive technology and why. We're really not going to spend a lot of time today going into specific tools or specific implementation, but just giving you an overview as far as considering the needs.
So last fall, this is Nancy, last fall ADAP conducted a survey on how AT in schools was being evaluated, planned for, and implemented. More than 150 families answered our online survey, and I will be the first to admit that the survey was not designed to be scientifically valid. We didn't randomize our potential respondents or anything like that. But nonetheless, I think it's fair to say that the survey results did give us some general impressions of how AT is being used in the state. Now, as Laura said a minute ago, today's presentation is on how IEP teams should approach the question of whether a student needs AT and how to consider that for him or her. The most telling response related to this issue of consideration is that for children not using AT, more than 3/4 of the parents who reported, reported that their children's IEP teams never even discussed the need for it at their children's IEP meetings. Yikes, that's bad, because of course under federal law, and federal and state law, AT is supposed to be discussed and considered at IEP team meetings. So it's that, for that particular group of parents whose kids didn't use AT, it apparently wasn't even discussed. So it's that complete lack of consideration, or maybe where consideration is given, it's still not very good consideration, that led Laura and me to decide to focus this first AT webinar on how IEP teams should approach the AT discussion.
And also, for all the participants, the handouts have been posted on startraining.org, and on the handout there is a link to the full ADAP summary of the survey, so you can see the other questions that were asked and the responses. So let's start at the beginning with IDEA, the law that requires assistive technology to become part of the IEP. The first thing the IDEA does is it defines what assistive technology device is. So it's any item, piece of equipment, or product system. So as you see the pictures, there's a picture of an item such as a pencil grip, a piece of equipment, so a Braille note taker, and even a product system like an FM system. So those are all types of assistive technology devices. And then the definition goes on. So these devices, whether acquired commercially off the shelf, modified, or customized. It's so great now to be able to walk into like Target or a office supply store and purchase assistive technology right off the shelf. For example, the LiveScribe Smart Pen. Great tool for note-taking. You can also easily modify assistive technology. So if a student has handwriting concerns and they need a slant board, all it takes is a fat 3-ring binder and a clipboard velcroed together or glued together, and now I've modified assistive technology device. And then you do have the customized, such as wheelchairs and some communication devices. And for those type of assistive technology devices, you do need an expert, someone that's certified, has an ATP, to make the decisions about the technology device. And these devices are used to increase, maintain, or improve the functional capabilities of a child with a disability. It's easy to forget when we're thinking about school. We think about the academics. We think about reading and writing and note-taking. But this definition is telling us we have to consider the functional capabilities of a child with a disability across the board. So we may have to consider things like adaptive equipment to help them eat. How are they going to access the computer? How are they going to access academic extracurricular activities, including sporting events, so maybe some adaptive wheelchair games. And finally, the definition includes the term does not include a medical device that is surgically implanted or the replacement of such device. So a student with a profound hearing loss may greatly benefit from something like a cochlear implant. And although that would help them access the curriculum, the definition says it does not include medical devices. Therefore, the school would not be obligated to help fund or help that child get a cochlear implant or even something like a feeding tube. Yes, that does improve their functional capabilities of a child, but because it's medically implanted, it's not necessary as part of the IDA to consider. So the IDEA goes one step further. Not only does it define what an assistive technology device is, it also defines what an assistive technology service is. So as you're looking at this PowerPoint, you see there's a wide variety of services. What it doesn't say, though, it doesn't say all services. It says any service, which tells me that a child doesn't necessarily have to have all of these services, but it's kind of not an a la carte, but really a flexibility to pick which ones are really appropriate for that individual child. So those services may include things such as evaluating a child's AT needs, purchasing or leasing, acquiring the AT device, selecting, designing, fitting, customizing, adapting, applying, maintaining, repairing, replacing AT devices, and coordinating and using other therapies, interventions, or services with AT devices. This is really crucial. I think most schools I've worked with have done a really good job coordinating the services, saying the speech therapist or the occupational therapist will assist, training or technical assistance for a child with a disability, and if it's appropriate for that child's family, and also the training or technical assistance for professionals, employers, or other individuals who provide services to employ or are otherwise substantially involved in the major life functions of that child. So the IDEA defines both what a device is and what a service is as far as implementation with education.
So where does AT fit into the IEP? Given the multifaceted nature of assistive technology, either devices or services, federal and state law provide that AT can be called and used in several different ways. It can be special education, it can be a related service, or it can be a supplementary aid in the service. And I know, Laura, you have some ideas about how to kind of conceptualize and place different things in different spots in the IEP. I don't know if you want to kind of talk about that for a second.
Sure. I know within the IEP, when you're thinking about these three areas, we can also think about, well, what areas would that be described within the IEP? So definitely the student background information. So if a student's currently using assistive technology, you would want to include it in the background, explain how it benefits them or what they have tried. You can also include it under an IEP goal. So if a student is using, let's say, a word processor to type written assignments, you might want to include the AT in the goal. The goal is not that the student will use a word processor. The goal is the student will write an essay using the word processor. So the AT is not the goal, but it could be a means to help them accomplish the goal. And we're going to talk to you in a minute where it's most often found in the IEP. But I love the new IEP formats because when we talk about the accommodations that students are being provided, there's that nice spot right there for assistive technology to include things that are currently being used or maybe things that have been tried and considered and didn't work. And so now we're going to show you what everyone's probably familiar with, the special instructional factors.
And each of the factors that are listed here from the Alabama IEP form are ones which the IDEA specifically says have to be quote-unquote considered by a child's IEP team when planning for his program. So, looking at this list, you might be tempted to think of this section of the IEP as a checklist. Unfortunately, sometimes when that's done, there's a tendency of IEP teams to kind of blow through them and not really engage in good, thoughtful consideration of them and discussion of them. Frankly, very often that's what I see happen in the IEP meetings that I attend, although I have to offer a big disclaimer at this point. By the nature of what I do, I attend IEP meetings where things have not gone so well in the past. I don't very often get to see the IEP or the IEP meeting that's humming along where everything is going perfectly. And I know that they exist, that there are hundreds of schools and teachers out there that get it and that do it right. So, my view of the general practice might be a little bit jaded. Just want to put that out there. So I'll step off my soapbox now, kind of lower myself back down into my computer chair again, and get back to the topic of consideration. Laura, if you could go to the next slide, maybe?
Yeah, and just before we leave this slide, too,
okay.
You were pointing out, too, with this special instructional factors, it was probably about 2 years ago when the form changed, because that question, does the student need assistive technology, used to read, has assistive technology been considered for that student? Right. I would see IEPs that checked no all the time, and for me that was literally a violation of IDEA, because IDEA requires that assistive technology to be considered. So I love that the state has rewarded how this reads, because it does better reflect what a child needs as far as assistive technology.
Okay, so then just to make sure that everybody's on the same page with this, the IDEA specifically says that the IEP team shall consider whether the child requires AT devices and services. And so let's do a little bit of English, I guess, grammar check here. Merriam-Webster defines the word to consider as to think about something carefully before making a decision or developing an opinion. And there you see Rodin's famous statue, The Thinker, thinking very hard. And I'd like to think that everybody in an IEP meeting is thinking that hard as well. So but what does it mean? I mean, functionally, what does it mean to think about or consider AT at an IEP meeting?
So, Nancy, I've realized that not everybody loves AT like I do. So let me try to put it in a concept that most people have had experience with. Right now we're going to do a quick poll, and I want to know how many of you have ever considered buying a car. So you're going to see the poll question pop up, and I want you just to respond, and then we'll share the response. Here comes the poll. See, lots of people are voting. That's great. Remember, if you are on an iPad, you will not be able to participate.
I didn't think iPads had any limitations, Laura.
Oh, not true, unfortunately. Well, I think we've given enough time. Let's share the results, and everyone will be able to see. Oops, actually I clicked the wrong thing. And I'm going to close the poll, and I'm going to share the results.
Oh.
Does everyone see the results?
I see them.
So it looks like 100% of the people have considered buying a car. So let's take a minute, and in your question box, think about if you would like to share, what is a question you've asked when you've considered buying a car? So just type it in, and I will read them aloud as they come in. Great. I have someone that asked, what is the price of the car? That is definitely something to consider. How's the gas mileage? Driving a Prius and driving an F-150, I know the difference. Another cost question. Ooh, an interest rate. Now that's a very higher order thinking question, because not only do you think about the cost of the car, what is it going to be a month, and as far as the interest? Is it safe? Yes, airbags are important. How much room do I need? Very good, because you know that little sports car doesn't hold car seats very well. Ooh, here's one I didn't think about. Are there new tires on the car? And then operating costs. Those are all excellent questions.
Laura, can I offer one verbally? Since
Oh,
I can't
absolutely.
type it in?
Sure.
So just the other day I was going out with somebody who was saying that he wanted to get a bulldozer to his house to do some gardening work, and he asked me if I had a truck he could borrow, and I said no, I have a little Toyota Camry. So, you know, what do you want to have accomplished by the vehicle that you purchase? Are you looking to just commute back and forth, or are you looking to haul stuff?
Absolutely. And one more question came in was how many owners? Good, something good to think about. And I'm going to share with you now the questions I've asked when considering buying a car. So the first one is, why do you need a new car? You know, that little blue junked car you see on the screen? It's kind of embarrassing to drive. Maybe it gets really good gas mileage, but you know, you might be embarrassed to drive it, so that's why you want a new car. Now, if it's broke down, that's a whole other reason why you need that new car. What do you need that new car to be able to do? I think this question kind of popped up several times, as well as what Nancy said. There's a big difference between a pickup truck, a sports car, and a minivan. So the function of what that car is going to be able to do for you is something definitely to consider. And I'm glad one of our users likes the blue car. They're welcome to it. And you're probably going to do some research. You know, some of those questions about the gas mileage and the cost of operating it. You have to research those to know the answer. And you just, even if you go to the car lot and ask the salesperson, they're not going to know the answer. They're going to pull out their smartphone too and look it up and try to figure it out for you. So that's an important part of that research when you're considering buying a car. Also, test driving it. I don't have enough money to go to a car lot and write a check and say, you know what, I want that yellow sports car. I don't care what it drives like, I want it. And having personally driven my boss's Jaguar, I wasn't that impressed with it. And I'm glad I drove it, because now I have no desire to own a Jaguar. So that's an important part of considering when you buy a car, is that test drive. And then crunch the numbers. And I love that someone mentioned, think about the interest rate and, you know, the monthly payments. That's something to consider when you're buying a car. And then you finally make a decision. So, you know, you buy that nice car and you're so happy, it's got the new tires, it's just the way you like it and you're satisfied with it. But sometimes you're not always happy with it. Like my F-150, I love it because it was a gift from my brother and I didn't have to pay a car payment. But I hate to tell you this, I'm just not happy with it. The gas mileage, it really gets along, just, it's terrible. But you know what? I have to live with it because I don't want a car payment. You know, maybe you pimp your ride and put some nice rims on your blue car to make it look more popular, and so therefore you don't need a new car. You can make do with certain things. And then your choice is, if you bought that car, do you sell it and go buy another one? Some people do that, or if you've leased it. So these are all things you might consider buying a car. Now, I wrote my questions ahead of time, and I loved that my questions were not the exact same questions that everyone else was asking, because we all have had different experiences with buying a car that have affected how we look at considering a new car. So it really depends on the person, and we go back to the definition, a slide earlier, it is developing an opinion. So that's what's really tricky. And as you saw with the car, it's definitely different opinions even when you're considering what's important to you. So let's bring this to something maybe that you're not as familiar with. Everyone, as indicated by the poll, has considered buying a car before, but maybe not everyone has considered assistive technology. So here's some pointers, and I'll let Nancy cover these.
Okay, I'll start off. The first one is that when you're sitting at an IEP meeting with a child sitting in front of you, you should remember that as a member of the IEP team, that all students with disabilities, regardless of the nature of the disability they have or its severity, need to have AT considered for them.
And just a point too, I think this has even changed systemically as far as the types of students that are under IEPs. I am still young to the field, but some of you that are veterans that have done 100,000 IEPs or feels like that, you know that 10, 15 years ago, most of the students with IEPs were significantly disabled. But now we're seeing a larger population of students with maybe learning disabilities, ADHD, executive functioning. So just as the IEPs have changed and included a lot more diversity within disabilities, the same thing when we're considering assistive technology, we have to consider that diversity.
The next consideration pointer for the IEP team is to remember that it is literally supposed to be a team activity. There's supposed to be a give and take, collaborative decision making, with all parties at the IEP meeting being able to contribute, including parents. And it's very often difficult for parents to, in certain parts of the development of an IEP, if they don't understand what's being discussed. So make sure that when you're working with parents, or if you're a parent yourself, seek out information about what AT is and how it might be able to help your child, how it's related to your child's disability-related needs and their curriculum, and seek out information about what the law requires to be, how the law requires AT to be provided. But definitely make sure it's a team activity. There should be no one person sitting at the table opining in this godlike voice, no, AT is not needed, or AT is needed and it should be X.
I think you kind of already touched on this, Nancy, about the informed knowledge and skills, and it's not just about the expert on the team. That's why I don't like to be a rock star, because being an expert's no fun. It's much more fun to be part of a team because each person has that different perspective. That's why, I'm sure any wives out there won't let your husband go pick out that car for you because they have a different opinion.
The other important thing about choosing or considering AT is that it is supposed to be guided by the student's IEP goals and objectives. You need to make that link between AT that may or may not be needed and where it is the student is looking to go educationally and what his objectives are. I call this one kind of show me the money consideration. In other words, show me the data, show me the evidence. Because if you're going to make a decision about AT, it shouldn't just be based on kind of like an eyeball assessment. You should be able to point to a reasoned decision as to why you're making the AT decision you're making.
And so thinking back again about considering the car, someone said that they were considering safety. Well, you want the data to show that, when they've done the test did the airbags deploy and how safe was and at what speeds. So you expect that data when you're choosing a car. You've got to learn to expect that data as well when you're considering AT in the IEP.
The next consideration point to remember is that you're not going to be thinking about just what you happen to have in your closet or what's the cheapest, what's available in the district. You should be thinking about a full range of AT devices that might be appropriate for that particular child.
And I think you'll see too when we continue with this presentation, it is a good place to start, though, is what you have in your classroom. With many of the schools going to bring your own devices or every child with a laptop, there's so much AT possibility right there that it's a great starting point, because then you don't have to worry about the money and the costs that are related to it, because the student already has access to it.
And then the last point is document the process, document the thinking that you went through and the results of that thinking in the IEP, including the supporting evidence. You'll see later on when we talk about some case law where school districts got hung up because they didn't do that very well. So it's real easy, again, because of the way the Alabama IEP form is set up, to just check that box and think that you're done. You're not. You need to explore in a little bit more detail in the IEP why you've decided what you've decided and to what end.
And it's hard to remember details. I know Nancy and I have talked about this being professionals in an IEP meeting, but being from a parent's perspective, this is all foreign language to them, so they even have a harder time remembering the details than you as a professional do. So it may be that you did consider it, but they get home and read it and they see that you checked the no box, and the parent feels like, well, you're denying my child something that they need, and then they don't realize that you did talk about it. So that's really important to document it, that you did discuss it, and how the questions maybe that were asked or the decisions that were reached.
And Laura, if I could give credit where credit is due at this point, I'd like to think that Laura and I were smart enough to make up these consideration pointers by ourselves, but we had some help. And you'll see down at the bottom of the screen a reference to the QIAT, Q-I-A-T, quality indicators for AT. And if I understand correctly, Laura, QIAT is a professional association of AT specialists, technicians, teachers,
yeah, absolutely,
who come together on their own to come up with AT technical assistance.
If anybody in the audience has actually participates in QIAT or has ever been to the QIAT website, could you just raise your hand? I'd like to see if there's anybody. Oh, there's so many people missing out on this resource. I'm disappointed. I've actually got to work with the QIAT in developing some of their goals at a conference. It's just an amazing group of hardworking individuals. There's absolutely no dollars funding behind it. It's really just professionals who want to assist other professionals in doing AT well, because we don't want AT to get a bad reputation as being expensive or difficult. The helpful things on their website, there are some resource documents that people have shared that are in the field that you may find helpful when you're doing your considerations or specifically for specific tools, and as well as there's an email listserv that you can become a member of and receive about 20 emails a day, or you can get it as a digest, so it's just one email a day, where professionals ask questions and other professionals give answers, because that's what I love about my job. I'm always learning, and that's one way I always learn, is by being a member of QIAT.
Laura, can I ask a question about it? Is it vetted by OSEP or anything like that?
No, it really is. I think there's 8 team members that started it, and they've gotten some grants along the way, but they really are not. They are not funded.
Okay.
So
okay.
I mean, I think that's part of the beauty of it, is that it's just strictly people wanting to do what they do better.
Okay.
All right, we're going to go on. So let's think about some possible decisions when you are considering that assistive technology in the IEP process. So the first decision is AT is not needed. Pretty simple and easy. You may also come to the conclusion that AT is already being used. Another decision is that AT needs to be tried. And maybe just the IEP team is not sure if or what AT is needed. So these are the 4 basic possible decisions that can come when considering assistive technology. Now I know I've oversimplified it, but simple is often best, and hopefully you can remember those 4 points. So let's give it a little whirl to see if we can consider AT from some various people. And these were adapted from the WADI, which is another resource that I've linked on the handout. So I have a student, Matt, and just so you know, all these students are fictitious, but very much similar to a typical child I may see when I am working with different children and students at schools. So Matt is a 4th grader. So we all know, since he's in 4th grade, you know the writing demands are really increased. Got to get ready for the standardized writing assessment. And then his handwriting, though, is slow and it's illegible. He does not like to write. His OT has tried some various pencil grips and lined paper and visual motor activities. So none of those have made a difference. We have the research and the data, or we have the data behind that from the OT notes and things she's tried. Spelling is not a concern. He can spell any word given. And there's no language or organizational concerns. So if you asked him a question, maybe you asked Matt, hey Matt, who's your favorite football team? He would go on and on that he is not an Alabama fan and he's not an Auburn fan, but he is in fact a Gator fan. And he would be able to have a verbal conversation beautifully, 3 to 4 sentences in length, and have a good flow. So organizational is not a concern. And he's also beginning some typing skills. And for this consideration, he's got about 6 to 8 words per minute. So are there any questions you feel like you need to answer before we can continue considering AT for Matt? And I kept it very simple. Does anybody have a specific question you'd like me to answer before we make our decision? Now, I would hope the IEP team would not spend just 2 minutes on a child. This would be a process. And because you're considering it at the evaluation, you've already talked about his strengths and his goals and things like that. I love a question came in. Has his motivation to write been addressed? Good question. You know, that is important to think about. Well, why isn't it that Matt doesn't like to write? And for this case, we're going to say that motivation's not an issue. He tries really hard. It's just that his handwriting is slow and it's illegible. He's a good student and he tries. So, assuming we have enough information, what do you think our decision for this consideration would be if we think back to those 4? And I'm going to let you make the decision. And I'm going to do that by giving you a poll. So I'm going to poll you to ask, what do you think that the conclusion from this AT consideration is? And here goes the poll. Got a few more people still voting. Thank you for everyone participating. We have an excellent participation rate at 77%. I'm very satisfied with that. And I'm going to go ahead and close this poll and let's see the results. So, as you see the results, no one thought that AT was not needed, so excellent. I would agree with you on that completely. 22% felt they're not sure if or what AT is needed. You know, that's always a good choice in my opinion, because that shows me that, you know what, we're not sure, so let's keep trying things. But most importantly, if you're going to say that, you better be willing to put the time to it to figure out, well, what is it he needs, whether you're going to try equipment and different things. 31% said AT is already being used, which is sort of true. He's tried the pencil grips and lined paper and visual motor activities, but because he's still illegible in his slow handwriting and still not being able to complete his assignments, it's still an issue. So if AT was being used, it's not effective. So it really does need to be considered differently. So the 47% of you says AT needs to be tried. So I'm going to go ahead and show you what my decision was. And again, this is when I considered AT for Matt, and Matt was a kid that I knew all the details about. And so the decision I came to was that AT does need to be tried. And it's important when you've come to that decision and you've made that consideration, what does it mean to say AT needs to be tried? So I said Matt will try using the classroom computers to type assignments requiring more than a paragraph to see if it can increase his speed and quality of writing. So I really quantified there that what it was. Because, you know, Matt is, even though he's a slow writer and is illegible, he doesn't need to be typing every single worksheet or every single short answer. So I tried to specify exactly how he was going to implement that trial. Are there any questions related to Matt, or maybe why we came to that decision? Okay, and feel free, again, to ask questions throughout. I am monitoring it. I like to multitask, so I'm good to go if you have a question, you want to type it in. So let's take a look at another student. So here we have Brian. Brian is a 10th grader. He independently uses the computer to type using a joystick and an on-screen keyboard. He is taking calculus, and he enjoys reading electronic and listening to audiobooks. And while you're considering those things, somebody asked about text-to-speech programs, or not text-to-speech, speech-to-text programs like voice recognition. And that is a completely different webinar, and if you have more specific questions, you definitely can ask. What I find, though, the short answer is that most students, especially a 4th grader, it's a little boy, his voice may be changing. 4th graders, it is hard to train voice recognition, and it's even harder to implement voice recognition in a classroom setting. It may work well for homework, and it may work well like in a resource room, but not in the general education classroom. But look forward, if that is a topic that you're interested in, please share that on your survey that you'd like a training on voice recognition. So here's Brian, and let's go ahead and do a poll for him and see what everyone feels if we considered what maybe he needs. I'm sure it feels like we've been waiting a long time, but it's only been 37 seconds. Okay, I think most people who have wanted to respond have had the chance, so let's close the poll and see the results. So, as we look at the poll, 0% says AT is not needed, which, yay. We've got a very smart audience, Nancy. 74% say AT is already being used, 17% says AT needs to be tried, and 9% is not sure if or what AT is needed. So let's take a look at what my consideration was when I was considering AT for Brian. And I'm going to stop sharing the results here. So for Brian, I agreed with the 74% of you that said that AT is already being used, because when we talked about Brian, when I described him, he was already using a wireless joystick to access the computer in the classroom and an on-screen keyboard to type all of his notes and assignments. And I didn't mention the audiobooks and the electronic books. That would definitely be stating that AT is already being used. For the 17% that says AT needs to be tried, kudos. I always think that there's new assistive technology that can be tried, but unfortunately in the school systems, sometimes we have to think about what is the tool that they need for the least restrictive environment, not the biggest, the best, the newest. So I would encourage this child to try different AT, and I would share resources with them, but I also have to be cautious to realize that it's not the school's responsibility to provide the newest and best. If he can access the curriculum independently, then that is meeting his needs. And we've got 2 more to consider. Oh, I did talk about this. Brian a little bit more. I talked about the print disability and being able to get the electronic books, and then there's some specialized math software that he could use to, yes, even do calculus. And that is, if you've ever tried to do calculus on a computer, it is not simple. So kudos to Brian for hanging in there and trying it. And I have met college students like Brian that are pursuing science and math degrees, and I really respect them and appreciate how hard they work at using the AT to make it work for them, because it is the only way they can access things that they enjoy and topics that they're interested in. So here we have Emilio, and he's a little 2nd grader, and he has an intellectual disability. His reading comprehension is at a primer level, and he also struggles with oral comprehension. So I can't talk to him quite like I talk to the other 2nd graders who don't have intellectual disabilities. He is working on extended standards, and he has mastered all of his IEP goals with accommodations and modifications. So what do you think we would consider for this student with using assistive technology? Oops, and I'm sorry, I need to slow down. A question's been asked regarding the 4th grader. Do you consider the adaptive strategy used by the student AT? So I think about the definition. That we had a definition of a device, and we have a definition of services. So as far as adaptive strategy, so let's say the 4th grader would write in cursive instead of print because he knew it was faster and more legible. I would definitely consider that when I'm making my AT decision, and I would definitely let the accommodation be that he could write in print or cursive, whichever he chose. So yes, I consider adaptive strategies when I consider AT, but I wouldn't necessarily say that the adaptive strategy is AT. Does that make sense, Nancy?
Well, it made sense to me, yeah. But then I didn't ask the question. It might be that the person who asked the question we could contact afterwards to make sure that we kind of go into more detail. Yeah, just if it's necessary.
Yeah, and I think that's an excellent question. So if a student is using a strategy and it's effective for them, you're definitely going to consider that with the AT, but I don't think it necessarily gets labeled under AT because it's not a device and it's not really a service. So unfortunately, there's always gray areas. So here's Emilio, and I'm going to go ahead and send a poll out for him, and let's see what everyone feels like we should consider when we're thinking about AT with Emilio. Okay, let's see the results. And I'm going to share the results for you. So as you can see, 0% think that AT is already being used, which there was no mention of that, so that's a great call. 18% says AT is not needed. 47% says AT needs to be tried. And 35% says you're not sure if or what AT is needed. Let me preface this before I show you the next slide. Remember, it's a consideration. The word definition of consideration did say an opinion. So when I was considering Emilio, I felt that AT was not needed. I based that decision on that there were no concerns with Emilio being able to access his curriculum in the least restrictive environment. So I would love to see any kind of questions or thoughts, if anyone would like to share about maybe why they didn't think, or maybe why they thought AT might be needed, or additional questions they would have liked to have known when considering Emilio. You want to just take a minute and write a question for us, or share a thought that you might have. And good, I'm glad someone responded, good. And someone said that thought the AT was needed because he had a problem communicating orally. Very good. So I didn't, when I was considering it, I didn't share with you that maybe Emilio does not have a language barrier. Maybe he's English speaking. Now, if he was an English language learner, or English was a second language, that definitely would be considered for the AT. And if he had articulation concerns that made him unintelligible to people he was speaking with, then yes, he might need to be considered AT as far as for communication. And somebody shared too that they have a assistive technology system that they use for students with hearing impairments called the Audio Trainer. And there is some research behind that that does help for students that struggle with oral comprehension, even attention. So good. That would be a very good consideration, considering even what tools you might have access to. And because it's already in place, it wouldn't cost the school anything to try it with him. So excellent point. So very good. Great questions and great responses, and thank you for sharing those. So let's look at our last student. And our last student is Angelina. And she is an 8th grader. 8th grade, you know, that means she's going to be transitioning to high school. And she struggles with organization. She is late turning in assignments. She completes them. She does a great job on them. She has the skills to do them, but she's just late turning them in. She forgets when projects are due. She also misses after-school activities, including cheerleading, so she has to be reminded about those. And she's been diagnosed with executive function disorder. Nancy, wouldn't you say, and I know that ADAP recently helped present a conference on this, wouldn't you say that that is something that's been on a rise, I would say, in the schools, concerns about executive functioning?
Yeah, well, the conference you're talking about is the ADHD conference, and one of the features of ADHD is difficulty with executive functioning. So yes, to that extent, yes.
Okay, so let's see what you all think we should do for Angelina when we consider assistive technology. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and share with you the results. I love that there's a overwhelming majority. 78% says AT needs to be tried, and 11% felt that AT was not needed, and 11% said not sure if or what is needed. So let's go ahead and go back to the slide. And so when I was considering it, it's kind of tricky because you're right, AT definitely needs to be tried, but maybe the IEP team is just not sure if or what AT is needed. And we've all been there, and every time I work with a student one-on-one, I can't immediately tell you they need these 10 things. I like to think about it and go home and say, wonder if this would work, and search for it. So for Angelina, I'm going to say that, you know what, I'm just not sure if or what AT is needed. You know, she's not been successful using a daily planner or calendar, and she has an Android smartphone and would like to use that. Now, I was unfair. You all didn't have that data when you were making the consideration. But how many times has the parent left an IEP meeting not telling you something, or you forgot to share something with the parent? It happens. So that can happen when you're considering AT. That can affect your consideration. And then so with her executive functioning disorder, it causes her to not be able to organize her thinking, not being able to prioritize tasks to get them completed. She can start a project but just can't seem to follow through with it because of her executive functioning. So because she's got an Android smartphone, the IEP is not sure if maybe there's an app that could help her. And so they're going to explore some options, and they're going to try some various apps. And if you'll look at it, I specifically said after spring break to determine which one may best assist her in high school. It's important when we're talking and considering AT to identify, when we're doing these trials, when and where they're going to take place to determine that they're going to be successful. It's just like if you go to test drive a car, if you test drive it on a rainy day, it's going to drive different than when you test drive it on a beautiful sunny day. And car salespeople know that, so they don't want you to come on rainy days. So even for her, we want to give her every opportunity to be successful using that app. So we're going to wait till after spring break, but we're going to do it before she goes into high school, because when she starts changing classes, that adds a whole nother level of complexity. So to summarize, when we've considered, it's important to know that when we're considering, there were different opinions, which is to be expected. There's no right and wrong when we're considering. The only wrong is if we don't consider at all. And I think Nancy's going to touch that on the next part of the presentation.
Yeah, I'm going to go through some assistive technology legal basics, some of the case law that I found regarding the issue of how to consider AT. We have a little over 5 minutes left in our hour, so I'm going to go through these kind of quickly and just bottom line it for you, and I think we can easily get that done. So our first principle, if you could go to the next slide, that's awesome. Laura, thanks so much. The bottom line is that if AT is necessary for a child to receive FAPE, then it has to be provided. And when you deny AT where it is necessary, then you're denying FAPE. So be very, very careful about how you're assessing and how you're providing it, because you could get hung up in some kind of due process dispute or other conflict there. The next one. This is, the bottom line is that letter to Fisher, that OSEP letter that I cited, provides an often quoted standard for how to do an AT evaluation. So you might want to take a look at that as you're thinking about your own school's practices.
And, just as a reminder, too, what FAPE stands for, Nancy?
Oh, I'm sorry. Free Appropriate Public Education.
So it doesn't stand for fantastic and the best of best?
No, free and appropriate.
Gotcha.
Bottom line on this one, again, citing to Fisher, this Nevada case shows that sometimes providing something is as bad as providing nothing if the something isn't matched to the needs of the child as identified through an assessment, and if the something you've given produces no benefit. So in this case, we had a child who was 7 years old. He had very significant speech and self-help delays, self-injurious behavior, often needed hand-over-hand instruction, was nonverbal, and had very significant intellectual impairments. The IEP team agreed that AT was needed, but it never made any reference to the process it used to determine that the student needed an AT device, and it never provided supporting information used to make that determination. There was no indication of what was to be used when. They provided something, but it was as if they just said, well, let's give this, when whatever it is they gave wasn't necessarily what the child needed.
And I think that that's part of the reason why IDEA doesn't just define the device, but it also defines those services, because I have yet to find the absolutely perfect AT device. So I think that that gets back to why we have to define services as well.
Okay, this next case example, the bottom line on this one, well, let me tell you a little bit about it first. It was a Maryland State Department of Education investigation involving a 15-year-old boy with a speech-language impairment. And the question was whether he needed a word processor to help with reading and writing needs. The student had transferred in from another school, and the new IEP team was presented with information from an AT evaluator from his old school who said that AT was needed, and the IEP team was presented with teacher reports showing that he was underperforming in reading and writing, but there was never any AT plan for the boy. The IEP team said no, it wasn't needed, but it never said why. So you had an evaluator providing information, but the IEP team never addressed it. And basically the State Department in Maryland came in and said that the IEP team, given that it had this information suggesting that AT was needed, had the obligation to refute or defend, had an obligation to address the evaluated data that they had in front of them. So here the IEP team in fact considered his need for an AT device, decided his needs could be addressed without it, but there was no documentation of why the team disagreed with the clear recommendation that from an AT evaluator that AT was needed. Another point just to remember is that independent education, this is going back again to Letter to Fisher, independent educational evaluations can be sought for AT evaluations where a parent disagrees with the results of the assessment that a school system does.
And just a note, I hate seeing my name in a child's IEP, so it's important when the parent requests this to list the organization, because you never know when private independent evaluators may or may not be available, and you don't want to get stuck paying the bill because there used to be someone in the state that did evals but now has moved to California, and because the IEP says that person's name, you're going to have to pay for that person to fly in from California.
Okay, the next, we have a couple of points about cost considerations. Letter to Cohen, basically, again, the bottom line is you can seek a parent's help via insurance, whether it's private or public, to fund AT, but you can't demand it. And I'll also mention very quickly that some of you might be aware that the Department of Education just released, or actually will be releasing tomorrow, guidelines regarding how schools will now be required to seek consent from parents regarding the use of Medicaid funds for Medicaid reimbursable services. They've switched up. It's been done a little bit. I'm sure the State Department of Education is going to be providing written guidance to you all soon and probably providing standard forms for you to be used when it comes to accessing Medicaid to fund AT or any other Medicaid service.
And also, when we're talking about costs, we're seeing this as well. Many private medical insurances now have capped the amount they're willing to pay for AAC devices. So before maybe their insurance covered 80%, now they may only cover a certain dollar amount. So this is where that cost consideration, even though it is expensive, we can't just consider the cost and say can't do it.
Okay, again, a cost consideration matter. Basically, while schools can take cost into consideration, it is not always a deciding factor. In this case, we're talking about a 13-year-old girl with multiple disabilities. The school wanted to use a device called an intro talker, while the parents wanted, I guess you'd say, a more sophisticated device called the Liberator. It was a communication device. And the hearing officer basically said, well, the intro talker is limited to basic stuff, while the Liberator started at basic but could move on. And there was testimony from the child's AT evaluator, including a video of the child using the Liberator, that showed she could benefit from it. Now, part of what made the hearing officer conclude that the child should get the more expensive device, so to speak, is that the district's expectations of the child had been too limited. And he felt that given the evidence that had been shown that the Liberator was the more appropriate device despite its higher price tag.
And this isn't to say, though, that free solutions aren't great. Free solutions can provide that fair access to public education when they have the features. And so in this case, the features did not match the child's needs when they were considering it. Therefore, it did not meet the criteria for the cheaper device.
Yeah. And then this gets to the point that Laura made earlier. The bottom line with this is when it comes to special education, you all probably know this very well, whether you're a parent or a teacher, it isn't what's best, it's what's appropriate. So these are two cases which demonstrate that a school district is not required to provide, you know, the old saying, the Cadillac, when a Chevrolet will do. These two cases exemplify that.
So sometimes a red visual timer is just as effective as an iPad visual timer app.
Yeah, well actually the second case, the Los Angeles case, that actually is an iPad case. And I think one of the things that certainly helped the school district in arguing that the iPad was not necessary is they had an assistive technology evaluator whose his CV must have been like 10 pages long. He had so much experience in AT and was able to very, very clearly demonstrate how the device the school wanted to use, which was called Springboard, was going to work perfectly fine and the iPad wasn't necessary.
Okay, and let's wrap it up with our points to remember.
Take us home, Laura.
Okay, well, first and foremost, AT is considered for all students with disabilities, regardless of the type or severity of disability. This is a change in thinking because it used to be that, oh, that my child's not physically disabled enough to need AT. Well, really, all students with various abilities can benefit from AT. AT is not just a device, it's also a service. We've talked about it's important to match the AT to the need. We didn't, this webinar didn't focus on matching it, but it's important to know that you do have to match that. And finally, AT is not just a checkbox on an IEP form. And you're welcome. The reason I work for a nonprofit is because I enjoy answering questions. So you are welcome to email me or call me if you have questions. Email is the easiest way to get a hold of me. And I know Nancy is the same way. You can contact ADAP.
Absolutely. We want to hear from you guys, and we're hoping that if you have follow-up questions, we're happy to answer them by email. Laura and I were talking about putting out a digest of kind of common questions that you guys might have about AT. And we're also looking to do more presentations like this.
Yeah, when you exit the webinar, you will see a survey. If you would just take 2 minutes and complete that, and I will also send you a certificate for attending the webinar. And once you complete that survey, it'll probably be tomorrow before I can get the certificates out to you, or next week. But Nancy and I will also hang around for a few minutes. So if you want to ask some questions, feel free. And I could open up the audio as well, but it may be too noisy. I'll just keep the questions to the question box. And the handout again is available at startraining.org, and feel free. And so we're going to hang around and answer some questions. So Nancy, I have a question. When students require AAC devices, such as an iPad with Proloquo to go, to access their curriculum, but also to need the same device for home and in the community, is the school's responsibility to provide the device?
Well, the first question is, regardless of how the child might otherwise use it, does he need it to receive FAPE at school? And if he does, then it needs to be provided. Then another question that could come up is, does the child need to have access to the iPad device while at home in order also to receive FAPE? So if the child's using the iPad during the school day to, I don't know, complete assignments, to communicate, to read enlarged text, then arguably he would need that device at home, would he not? Or potentially he would need it at home in order to do homework assignments. So in that case, the school would be required to allow him to use it at home. Now, if he also ends up playing, I don't even know what.
Angry Birds.
Solitaire on it.
No, it's Angry Birds.
You know, yeah, whatever, yeah, Angry Birds. That's better. That's more up to date. It shows how old school I am talking about solitaire. You know.
Oops, sorry.
The school has to provide it.
I'm sorry, Nancy. We missed that. After Angry Birds, you said that you just
basically. Well, if he needs it at home in order to receive FAPE, then it would be incumbent on the school to provide him access to it at home as well.
And hopefully, again, that device was chosen because it was considered, various apps were considered and compared and different things. Somebody asked if the actual PowerPoint will be available. I have no problem publishing it on Star Training. Is that okay with you, Nancy?
Oh, it's perfectly fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
And remember, we're recording it, and I'm still recording it, so even your questions will be saved on the webinar, so feel free to watch it as frequently as you want. I can't give you second credit, though. And Nancy and I are going to wait about 2 more minutes to see if anybody else has any questions. Feel free. Another one person shared that they had a similar incident, but instead of an iPad, they went with an iPod. Excellent choice. And I'm actually not an Android fan or a Kindle Fire fan, but there are awesome communication apps on both of those now. So, you know, that's even something to consider. I think
in preparing for this presentation, I did a whole bunch of readings on assistive technology, and I read one case, I think it was out of Indiana, where the child's IEP team, because he had behavioral difficulties, one of the interventions they did was provide him, I don't know whether it was an iPod or a handheld something, for him to use on the school bus to keep him busy. And as long as he had that little gizmo in his hand doing whatever, he was not a behavioral problem. So there you go.
And another good question, and this is something we just ran out of time talking about. If the device is repeatedly broken at home, how often should the school repair it?
Well, if you go back to one of the very first slides, you'll see that repairing an assistive technology device is a service, so it is the obligation of generally it is the obligation of the school to repair the device. I have seen some state rules and some case law about how, if a device is repeatedly broken at home, that a parent can be made, you get it under a certain condition that at some point or another you assume liability. Frankly, I'm not really sure how that works. I think if it does repeatedly get broken, it might just be incumbent on the school district to up its insurance policy on the darn thing and try and cover the costs that way.
I do believe I saw some case law related to that, though, that if there was like an intentional damaging at home, yeah, that the parent can be liable. And I think Quiet even has a agreement form on their resources that talk about the parent's responsibility when AT goes home.
Yeah.
Another question, and this is interesting, and I have an opinion, but I'm going to let Nancy, the lawyer, answer it. Somebody asked Nancy, is it appropriate if AT is being used effectively, but it is not listed in the IEP because it's a routine and part of the curriculum? So I think that they want to know, is that appropriate? So, or should it be listed as the IEP? Want me to read it again?
It's hard to answer in the abstract without knowing what it is, but I mean, if it's part of the same supports and services that are offered to all children, regardless of disability, so if all children have a lesson planner that they have to use, I'm not sure why I wonder if that's what if that kind of situation is what the person's talking about.
I'm not sure, but I would also want to remember the IEP is not supposed to be the IEP is a document that's really supposed to guarantee that child that access to the curriculum. And so if the child moved to a different school system, maybe the child has access to a computer because it's part of the routine at the current school, but what if he goes to another school and it's not part of it? Because the IEP didn't specify that child wouldn't be guaranteed that assistive technology access. So for the child's benefit, I think it is really important to include it in the IEP, and have it in there so in case they change schools or in case for some reason the situation changes and it's not part of the routine any longer.
Well, I think the other reason why what you say is makes a lot of sense, Laura, is especially for older kids who are getting ready to go off to college. Colleges look carefully at the accommodations that have been provided to students, and you're going to have a much easier chance of getting those accommodations in an institution of higher ed if you can document how it's been provided before.
And if we didn't answer that question, I'd encourage the asker to email us privately or call us, and we can talk through that as well. Another question, and I'll be honest, this is a question I baffle with all the time. What is the difference between the school having to provide equipment, such as an iPad with Proloquo, versus the parent having to provide the equipment, such as like a wheelchair? Because, you know, the wheelchair is a medical device, but it's not surgically implanted, so it doesn't fit into that.
We actually had a case like that where a parent had, well, the child had a Medicaid-provided wheelchair, and it was getting dinged up quite badly at school. And I forget the exact details, but the bottom line is it got broken. The parent was going through a lot of heartache and grief with the Medicaid agency trying to get it fixed. And so at a point of great frustration, the parent said, essentially, I don't want my child taking essentially my Medicaid-provided wheelchair to school because I'm tired of dealing with it getting broken. So the school needs to provide a wheelchair. And yeah, the parent, now it ended up getting worked out, but in theory the parent could have said that I'm going to get my child to school and then we're going to transfer him to your wheelchair because it's an assistive technology device. And there's a whole line of cases, or not cases, but OSEP letters that talk about how even kind of personally prescribed devices or personally fitted devices like a wheelchair, like hearing aids, like glasses, if they're required to provide FAPE, then although it's rare, it is possible that a school would be required to provide those things, wheelchair, glasses, hearing aids, if there's no other way for the child to get them. Now, more often than not, parents don't want to muck around with that, and nor do schools for that matter. But in theory, if those devices were required to provide FAPE, then a school would have to provide them.
And this is where I encourage parents as well when I have the opportunity to work with parents, is even though the school is required, let's say, to provide that communication device, well, what is going to happen when that child leaves the school or during the summer and they're not doing curriculum things? It's really not the school's responsibility to provide it then, because they don't need it to access the curriculum during the summer. And so I try to empower the parents by explaining to them, you've got the resource, you know, you've got medical insurance that will cover this. It's best for you to purchase that. Now the iPad's another boat because insurance is not covering that yet. But I do think that helping educate parents as well what their resources and options are can help prevent that quandary from arising when the school has to buy a medical device. Well, I think we are good, Nancy, and I hope anyone else who has questions will email us and call us. And thanks again for everyone who's participating. And thanks, Nancy. I had fun.
Thank you, guys.